The loaf of bread was a small, plain thing, still warm enough that the scent of yeast and hearth tickled the edges of Eliza Abernathy's hunger. It was a cruel temptation, a promise of life sitting innocently on a rough-hewn shelf in Thorne's mercantile. Her stomach, a hollow and aching cavern, clenched in protest. She hadn't eaten in a day. Her younger brother Samuel was back at the farm, his small body racked with a fever she couldn't quell with cool water and prayer alone. A little bread, a little broth, might give him the strength he needed. Her hand, chapped and calloused from a lifetime of farm work, trembled as it hovered over the prize. The air in the store was thick with the smells of civilization and commerce. Cured bacon, pickling brine, bolts of cotton, and the cloying sweetness of penny candy in a glass jar on the counter. Over it all lay the scent of its owner, Jedediah Thorne, a faint, unnerving mix of bay rum and avarice. Eliza's gaze darted around the store. It was empty. The late afternoon sun cast long, dusty shadows that hid the corners and made phantoms of the stacked barrels and sacks of flour. Thorne was likely in his office in the back, hunched over his ledgers, counting the debts that were slowly strangling the life out of the valley. This was her chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt and desperation. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her family's survival was the only currency that mattered. With a final, fearful glance toward the back office, she moved. Her hand closed around the loaf, its warmth a shock against her cold skin. She swiftly tucked it into the worn canvas satchel at her side, the rough fabric scratching her knuckles. She turned, her boots silent on the dusty floorboards, her entire being focused on the rectangle of blinding sunlight that was the open door, the gateway to freedom. 3 more steps. 2. Find everything you were looking for, Miss Abernathy? The voice was as smooth as oil and as cold as a winter river. It stopped her dead, freezing the breath in her lungs. Jedediah Thorne emerged from the shadows behind the counter, a place he had no business being. He hadn't been in his office at all. He had been watching her, his lips curved into a smug, predatory smile that didn't reach his pale, calculating eyes. Panic, hot and sour, flooded Eliza's throat. "Mr. Thorne?" she stammered, her mind racing for a lie, an excuse. "I was just looking." "Oh, I'm sure you were," he purred, his eyes glinting. He stepped out from behind the counter, his movements unhurried and deliberate, like a coyote circling a trapped rabbit. "But it appears you have already found something." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His power in Redemption Gulch was absolute, a silent, suffocating presence. He slowly walked toward her, and with a theatrical flourish reached into her satchel. His fingers brushed against hers, a touch that felt like a violation. He pulled out the loaf of bread and held it up between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a dead rat. "This," he said, his voice dropping, "is a problem." The shame was a physical blow so intense it made her ears ring. In the suffocating silence of the store, under the weight of his triumphant gaze, Eliza felt the floor drop out from beneath her world. Thorne didn't call for the sheriff. That would have been too simple, too public. His cruelty required an audience of one. He relished the slow, meticulous process of breaking a person's spirit. He placed the loaf on the counter with mock reverence and leaned in close, his breath smelling faintly of whiskey and self-satisfaction. "The law in this town takes a dim view of thievery, Eliza," he said, his voice a confidential whisper. "A night in a jail cell. Public humiliation in front of your friends, your family. A permanent stain on the Abernathy name." He let the words hang in the air, each one a tiny, poisoned dart. "But perhaps," he continued, circling around her, "we don't need to involve the law." He stopped and ran a finger along a sack of flour, leaving a pale trail in the grime. "I am a reasonable man. I am aware of your family's predicament." He said the word as if it were a disease. "The drought, your father's unfortunate accident, the outstanding balance on his loan, which I hold, of course." He smiled again, a flicker of his teeth in the gloom. "I am, above all, a pillar of this community. I believe in helping my neighbors." Eliza stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She knew what was coming. Every woman in the valley knew the kind of help Jedediah Thorne offered. I am prepared to overlook this misunderstanding, he said, his eyes now crawling over her face, her neck, the line of her worn calico dress. In exchange for a small service, you can work off your family's debt, and the cost of the bread naturally. I find myself in need of a personal assistant, someone to help me in the evenings, tidying up the saloon after hours, perhaps. The implication was as thick and foul as stagnant water. He wanted to parade her as his possession, to install her in the smoky, leering confines of his saloon, a place no decent woman would ever set foot. He wanted to break her proud spirit, to make her another one of his acquisitions. The disgust was so potent it almost choked her. To be owned by this man, to suffer his touch, his presence, it was a fate worse than any jail cell. Tears of rage and helplessness burned at the back of her eyes. She opened her mouth to refuse, to spit in his face, to tell him she would rather starve. But before any sound could escape, a new voice cut through the tension. How much for the bread? The voice was low and steady, with a dust-dry rasp that spoke of long trails and open skies. Both Eliza and Thorne turned toward the door. A man stood there, silhouetted against the afternoon light. He had been standing in the corner, by the barrel of nails, a silent observer to the entire sordid affair. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty, plain clothes that had seen better days. His face was unremarkable, weathered by sun and wind, but his gaze was steady and unnervingly direct. He was a stranger. Thorne recovered first, annoyance flashing across his features. He hated interruptions, especially when he was enjoying himself. "This is a private matter," he snapped. The stranger took a step into the store and the floorboards creaked under his weight. He ignored Thorne and looked at the loaf of bread on the counter. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice still quiet but with an edge of steel that brooked no argument. "How much is it?" Thorne sneered, his arrogance reasserting itself. He would make this interloper pay for his gall. For that particular loaf, given the circumstances of its acquisition, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The price is $5. It was a preposterous sum, enough to buy 50 loaves. It was a challenge, a dismissal. But the stranger didn't flinch. He walked calmly to the counter, pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt, and counted out several heavy coins. The silver clinked loudly in the charged silence. He pushed the coins across the polished wood toward Thorne. They were more than enough. Then he turned his gaze to Eliza. It was a look devoid of pity or judgment, a simple, clear-eyed assessment of the situation. "Your debt is paid," he said. He picked up the loaf of bread from the counter and held it out to her. "This is yours." Eliza stared at him, then at the bread, then at the stunned, furious face of Jedediah Thorne. For the second time in 10 minutes, she was utterly speechless. She numbly took the offered loaf, its warmth a small, solid anchor, in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Eliza stammered a thank you, her voice barely a whisper, and fled the store. The stranger, who she now knew as Caleb "Cal" Rivers, followed her out into the blinding sunlight and suffocating dust of Redemption Gulch's main street. From the doorway of the mercantile, Thorne watched them go, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been publicly thwarted, his power challenged, his prize snatched from his grasp. It was an insult he would not forget. The town itself seemed to hold its breath as they walked. Faces peered from windows, then quickly vanished. Men lounging on the boardwalk fell silent, their gazes following the unlikely pair. Redemption Gulch was Thorne's town, and everyone knew it. To defy him was to invite ruin. "Why did you do that?" Eliza finally managed to ask, her voice still trembling. Cal kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I don't like to see a man abuse his power," he said simply. There was no boast in his tone, just a plain statement of fact. Their path was abruptly blocked. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose stained shirt strained at the buttons over his belly, stepped in front of them. His face was flushed, and a perpetual sneer seemed to be etched into his features. He was Thorne's man, the blunt instrument of his will. "Well, well, Miss Abernathy," Brody said, his voice oily. "Mr. Thorne mentioned a disturbance at his establishment. Something about stolen goods." He was performing, playing the part of the lawman while his eyes darted nervously between Eliza and the quiet stranger beside her. He was here to intimidate, to drag her back into Thorne's web under the guise of legal procedure. "The matter is resolved," Cal said, his voice calm and low. He didn't move, but his presence seemed to solidify, becoming an immovable object in Brody's path. "The debt was paid." Brody's eyes narrowed. He was used to cowing desperate farmers and meek townsfolk. This man was different. There was a stillness about him, a coiled tension that suggested he was far more dangerous than he looked. The sheriff licked his lips, his bluster deflating slightly. "Is that so?" he grumbled. "Well, I'll be keeping an eye on you, Abernathy's. Trouble seems to follow you." He shot a last hateful glare at Eliza before swaggering off toward the saloon. The threat was clear. Thorne's reach was long, and the law was his weapon. Cal insisted on accompanying Eliza back to her family's farm. The Abernathy homestead was a testament to a long and losing battle against fate. The fields were brown and cracked, the fences were in disrepair, and the small cabin seemed to sag under the weight of despair. Inside, Eliza's father, Thomas, lay on a cot, his leg, badly broken in a fall 2 months prior, propped up on a set of feed sacks. His face, once handsome and proud, was etched with lines of pain and shame. 12-year-old Samuel was curled under a thin blanket, his breathing shallow, his face slick with the sweat of his fever. After Eliza explained the day's events, Thomas struggled to sit up, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked Cal. He offered the stranger the only hospitality they had left, a seat at their table and a cup of water from their nearly dry well. As evening bled across the sky, casting the small cabin in shades of purple and orange, Cal finally revealed the true reason for his presence. He hadn't just been passing through, he had been in Redemption Gulch for a week, long enough to understand the power dynamics, long enough to recognize Thorne for the predator he was. "Paying for the bread didn't solve your problem," Cal said, his voice gentle but firm. "It made it worse." He looked from Thomas's worried face to Eliza's. "A man like Thorne doesn't operate on money. He operates on pride and power. I wounded his pride today. I challenged his power. He won't let that stand. He'll use your debt, he'll use the sheriff, he'll use any means necessary to ruin you. Not just to get your land, but to make an example of you. To punish her." He nodded toward Eliza. The small spark of hope that had flickered in the cabin died, plunging them back into a deeper, colder darkness. Cal let the grim reality settle before he continued. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression deadly serious. "There's only one thing Thorne respects, and that's property. He won't cross a line to take what belongs to another man, not if that man is willing to fight for it." He paused, his gaze finding Eliza's across the dim room. "He won't stop until he has you, but he can't touch another man's wife." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside. Eliza stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. "Marry me," Cal said, his tone as straightforward as if he were discussing the weather. "It wouldn't be a real marriage, it would be a business arrangement, a shield. I have a small ranch up in the northern canyon outside of town. Thorne's influence doesn't stretch that far. As my wife, he would have no claim on you. You would be under my protection, and I would give you my word," he added, his gaze shifting to Thomas, "to see that your family is protected as well. It's the only way." The proposition was so outlandish, so utterly insane, that for a moment, Eliza thought she was in a fever dream. To escape one man's ownership by accepting another's? It was a medieval bargain, a transaction of flesh and name. Her pride, already battered and bruised, roared back to life. "No," she said, the word escaping her lips in a choked gasp. "Absolutely not." After Cal stepped outside to give them privacy, the cabin became a crucible of fear and debate. Thomas was horrified, his shame at his inability to protect his own daughter, warring with the cold, pragmatic truth of Cal's words. "To sell you like chattel?" he whispered, his face pale. "I can't." "He's not buying me, Pa," Eliza argued, pacing the small space. "He's offering a cage to protect me from a wolf. I won't do it. We can fight Thorne. We can endure." But their argument was interrupted by a small, frightened sob. Samuel had woken up. He had heard everything. "I'm scared, Liza," he whimpered, his eyes wide with a terror that cut through Eliza's defiant pride. "Sheriff Brody? He looks so mean. Is Mr. Thorne going to take our house?" Samuel's fear was the cold, hard reality that shattered their arguments. They had no money, no allies. The law was a weapon pointed at their heads. Thorne's cruelty was a known quantity, his vengeance a certainty. They weren't choosing between honor and dishonor. They were choosing between a strange, desperate kind of survival and absolute, grinding ruin. The choice was no choice at all. By the time the sun rose, casting a pale, unforgiving light on their exhausted faces, the decision had been made. Eliza, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, stepped out of the cabin and gave Cal her answer. The ceremony was a bleak, hurried affair in the stuffy, book-lined office of the circuit judge. The judge, a nervous man named Peters with sweat stains under his arms, mumbled the words as if he were afraid Thorne himself might burst through the door. Eliza stood beside Cal, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster wall. They were two strangers, bound by a contract of desperation. The words love, honor, and cherish were a bitter mockery. As Judge Peters pronounced them man and wife, Eliza risked a glance toward the doorway. Her blood ran cold. Jedediah Thorne was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest, watching. He hadn't come to object. He had come to witness his defeat. But the look on his face wasn't one of concession. It was a look of chilling, possessive promise. It was a look that said, "This is not over. This changes nothing." The shield she had just acquired suddenly felt terribly, frighteningly thin. The wagon ride to Cal's ranch was a long, rumbling exercise in silence. Eliza sat stiffly on the buckboard seat, clutching the small cloth bag that contained the few possessions she'd brought from home. The vast, sun-bleached landscape of the canyonlands stretched out around them, empty and indifferent. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a void, filled with the thousand things they weren't saying to each other. He was her husband. The thought was so absurd she almost laughed. She knew nothing about him, save for the fact he disliked injustice and was willing to pay $5 for a loaf of bread. He pointed out landmarks in a strained attempt at conversation. "That's Hawk's Peak," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a distant, jagged crag. "Creek's dry this time of year, but it runs deep in the spring." "Oh," Eliza would reply, her voice small. She studied him from the corner of her eye, trying to piece together the man she had married. His hands, holding the reins, were steady and capable. There were lines of weariness around his eyes that had nothing to do with the sun. He was a closed book, written in a language she didn't understand. The marriage, the reason for this journey, felt less real. With every mile that passed, like a bizarre story she was being told rather than a life she was living. They arrived at dusk, pulling into a small, defensible canyon carved from the red rock. Cal's ranch was not so much a ranch as a foothold against the wilderness. A small Spartan cabin stood beside a sturdy corral and a modest barn. It was clean, functional, and utterly devoid of any personal touch. It was the home of a man who wasn't planning on staying, or of one who had forgotten how to live. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center, and a single bed was pushed against the far wall. The question of their new domestic arrangement hung in the air, thick and awkward. Cal addressed it immediately, his tone matter-of-fact. "The bed is yours," he said, setting his saddlebags by the door. "I'll take the floor by the fire." The gesture was one of respect, a small, unexpected kindness that pricked at her defenses. But it also drew a clear line between them, reinforcing the chasm of their strange contract. That night, Eliza lay stiffly in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance and the soft, steady breathing of the stranger on her floor. She felt as if she'd been set adrift in a vast, empty sea, and she was more alone than she had ever been in her life. The days that followed fell into a quiet, monotonous rhythm. Eliza, however, was not built for idleness. She was a farmer's daughter, and work was as essential to her as breathing. She rose at dawn with Cal, her pride demanding that she earn her keep. She scrubbed the cabin until the wooden floors gleamed, tended to the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the cabin, and mended Cal's worn shirts with neat, even stitches. She was not just a guest or a charity case, she was a partner in this arrangement, and she would pull her weight. Cal was a man of similar constitution. He worked from sunup to sundown, his movements economical and purposeful. He mended fences, tended his small herd of cattle, and chopped firewood with a relentless, steady rhythm. They worked in tandem, two solitary planets orbiting a common sun of necessity. They spoke only when necessary, exchanging information about chores or supplies. Yet in the spaces between the silence, a fragile understanding began to grow. Eliza noticed the gentle way he handled his horse, whispering to it as he brushed its coat. Cal, in turn, saw the fierce, determined set of her jaw as she hauled 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, refusing his offer of help. They were observing each other, taking each other's measure. One evening, as she was preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Eliza found the courage to ask a question. "Do you have any family, Cal?" He stopped sharpening his knife and stared into the fire for a long moment. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Not anymore." The finality in his tone closed that door to her. A moment later, he surprised her by asking one of his own. "How is your father's leg?" "The doctor says it will heal, but slowly," she replied, grateful for the flicker of concern. "He says my father is not a young man anymore." It was a tiny exchange, a brief crack in the wall of their mutual isolation. But it was a start. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a name, but two people sharing a space, a struggle in the quiet, unspoken weight of their past. A week after the wedding, Eliza announced that she was riding into town to visit her family and purchase supplies they couldn't grow or make themselves. A flicker of something, protest, concern, crossed Cal's face, but he simply nodded. "I'll ride with you," he said. It wasn't a question. The moment they reached the outskirts of Redemption Gulch, the atmosphere shifted. It was a tangible thing, a chilling drop in temperature. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had known Eliza since she was a baby, saw her coming and abruptly turned to fuss with a display of apples, her back rigid. Two men talking on the saloon porch fell silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Thorn's poison had worked its way deep into the town's soul. The mercantile was the worst. The clerk, a young man named Billy, who had once tried to court her, refused to meet her eyes His face flushed with embarrassment as he served her. And then Thorn appeared. He seemed to materialize from his back office, his presence sucking the air from the room. He approached her, his lips curved in that familiar, hateful smile. "Mrs. Rivers," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. He savored the name, rolling it on his tongue like a fine wine. "A pleasure to see you. I do hope your new arrangement is to your liking. The canyon can be a lonely place." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "You know, my generous offer of employment is always open, should you find yourself in a less rustic situation." The public humiliation was a physical assault. He was painting her as a whore, a kept woman who had sold herself to a stranger. Eliza's face burned, but she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a cold fury she didn't know she possessed. "I am quite content, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you for your concern." She turned and walked out of the store, Cal at her side, leaving Thorne standing amidst his silent, complicit audience. The visit to the farm was even more disheartening. Her father looked smaller, more defeated than he had a week ago. "Thorne sent Brody yesterday," Thomas told them, his voice a weary rasp. "He's called in a portion of the loan, $100, due in 2 weeks. Says it's in the contract." It was an impossible sum. Worse, the small creek that provided the farm with its lifeblood had dwindled to a muddy trickle. "Just dried up overnight," Samuel said, his young face etched with worry. Cal's expression hardened. He walked out toward the creek bed, his long strides eating up the parched ground. Eliza stayed with her family, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. As they were talking, 2 figures on horseback appeared at the edge of their property. The Gallo brothers, Manny and Sal, Thorne's resident thugs. They didn't ride in close, they didn't have to. Their menace was casual, effortless. Manny, the larger of the two, dismounted and lazily kicked open a section of fence, allowing the Abernathy's 3 scrawny cows to wander out toward the dusty plains. Sal laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. as Samuel scrambled to herd them back. "Nice day, Mrs. Rivers," Sal called out, his tone mocking. "Heard you moved up in the world." They were Thorne's messengers, delivering a clear signal of his displeasure. Cal returned just as they were riding off, their laughter echoing behind them. His face was grim. "It's a dam," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Upstream, a new one, made of rocks and felled logs. They've blocked the water." The attack was no longer veiled in rumor and social pressure. It was here. It was real. It was a siege. That night, back at the ranch, Eliza couldn't sleep. She was consumed by a burning mixture of guilt and fury. This was her fault. Her family was suffering because she had dared to defy Thorne, because she had dragged this quiet, honorable stranger into her fight. She slipped out of bed, her mind made up. She would go back tonight and tear that dam apart with her bare hands if she had to. She was saddling her horse in the moonlight when Cal emerged from the cabin. He didn't say a word, just watched her for a moment, his face cast in shadow. She expected him to argue, to tell her it was too dangerous. Instead, he simply said, "I'll come with you." For hours, they worked under the cold, silver light of the moon, their bodies dark shapes against the pale landscape. They hauled rocks, their muscles screaming in protest. They used a long branch as a lever to pry logs from the mud, the creek water soaking them to the bone. It was brutal, back-breaking labor, a silent, shared battle against Thorne's malice. Finally, with a great sucking sound, the last log came free. The water, held back for days, surged forward with a triumphant gurgle, a living thing released from its prison. Exhausted, they collapsed on the muddy bank, their breathing ragged. The shared struggle, the raw physical effort, had broken down the last of their walls. In the quiet that followed, Eliza began to cry. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, heartbroken tears that tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "It's my fault," she whispered, the words she'd been holding back finally spilling out. "All of this. My father, the farm, you. I've ruined everything." Cal didn't offer empty platitudes. He sat beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the darkness. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and rough with an old pain. "I was a Texas Ranger," he said, the confession startling her, "for 5 years. I thought I was doing good. We got a tip about some rustlers holed up on a homestead. We went in fast, at dawn. But the tip was wrong. It wasn't rustlers. It was just a family, a man, his wife, their 2 sons. There was shooting, confusion. When the smoke cleared..." He trailed off, his voice catching. "The woman was dead. I left the Rangers the next day." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a haunted sorrow she was only just beginning to understand. "I ran from that," he said. "I came here looking for a place so quiet I could forget. I swore I would never get involved in other people's fights again. But what Thorne is doing to you, to your family, it's the same kind of wrong. It's a bully with a badge, or in his case, a ledger. And I've learned something out here in the quiet. You can't run from who you are. I won't run from this." He was offering her not just his protection, but his past, his wounds, his reason for being here. In that moment of shared vulnerability, by the banks of a freed creek in the dead of night, Eliza saw the man behind the stoic facade. She realized they were both fugitives from their own histories. Their marriage of convenience had just become something more. It had become an alliance. The small victory at the creek changed the air between them. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar seedling, began to sprout in the barren ground of their arrangement. They knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. Thorne could dam the creek every week. He could send the gallows to harass her family daily. Defending was a losing game. They had to attack. "We can't outfight him, and we can't outspend him," Cal said one evening, his eyes fixed on the map he'd drawn in the dirt floor of the cabin. "But we can go around him." His plan was simple and audacious. They would pool their resources, Cal's small herd of cattle, and the meager but salvageable crop of vegetables from the Abernathy farm, now that it had water again. They would bypass Redemption Gulch entirely and drive their goods to Harmony Creek, a larger town 2 days' ride to the east. It was a risk. The trail was difficult, and if Thorn found out, he would surely try to stop them. The journey was an ordeal that forged them together more than any ceremony could have. A ferocious thunderstorm turned the trail into a river of mud, forcing them to huddle together under a leaky oilcloth, the lightning illuminating their faces. A wagon wheel shattered on a rock, and they spent half a day fixing it, Cal's strength and Eliza's ingenuity working in perfect concert. They took turns on watch at night, the campfire a small bastion of warmth against the immense, dark wilderness. Around that fire, they began to talk. Eliza told him about her mother, who had died when she was 10, and her dream of one day seeing the ocean. Cal spoke of his own childhood on a farm in East Texas, of the brother he'd lost to cholera. The stories were small, simple things, but they were dadlat. They were the building blocks of a life, the currency of intimacy. Cal taught her how to handle his rifle, his hands briefly and gently closing over hers to adjust her grip. Eliza, in turn, showed him how to use a poultice of herbs to soothe an injured calf, her knowledge of the land surprising him. A genuine affection, tender and tentative, was blossoming in the heart of their desperate enterprise. Harmony Creek was a revelation. It was a bustling, prosperous town with a fair market and people who smiled at them. They got a good price for the cattle and an even better one for Eliza's vegetables. They earned more than enough to pay Thorne's extortionate demand, with plenty left over for supplies and seeds for the next planting. The ride back was different. The silence was comfortable, filled with a shared sense of triumph. They had fought back, and they had won. News traveled fast in the West. A week later, in his opulent office above the saloon, Jedediah Thorne listened to Sheriff Brody's report, his face darkening with every word. "The Abernathy debt was paid in full this morning," Brody grumbled, shifting his weight. "And a traveler I was talking to? He saw him, in Harmony Creek, said they sold a whole wagon load of produce and a half-dozen head of cattle." Thorne said nothing. He walked to the window and stared down at the town he owned, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. It wasn't the money. It was the defiance. It was the gall. They had found a way around him. They had worked together, succeeded together. The thought of them finding a sliver of happiness, a moment of triumph, was a personal insult that burned hotter than any financial loss. His obsession with Eliza, his desire to possess and break her, curdled into a venomous, all-consuming rage. He turned from the window, his eyes cold and flat. The Gallo brothers, who had been lurking in the corner, straightened up. The time for petty harassment was over. The time for games had passed. "I want to break them," Thorne snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I don't just want their land anymore. I want them to have nothing. I want them to suffer. Go out there tonight. Burn the Abernathy's barn to the ground. And make sure the old man gets a good look at it." The hope at the Abernathy farm was a palpable thing. Cal and Eliza had arrived with the wagon full of supplies, their success a balm on the family's wounded spirit. For the first time in months, there was laughter in the small cabin. Thomas was sitting up, a rare smile on his face as Eliza told him about the market in Harmony Creek. Samuel was excitedly planning what they would plant with the new seeds. It was a fragile, perfect moment of peace. The smell of smoke came first, sharp and acrid. Then, a hellish orange glow began to flicker through the cabin window. They rushed outside and into a nightmare. The barn, the heart of the farm, was an inferno, flames clawing at the night sky. Silhouetted against the blaze, two horsemen, the Gallo brothers, reared their mounts, laughing, before spurring them into the darkness. "No!" Thomas screamed, a sound of pure agony. Forgetting his injured leg, his mind consumed with the desperate need to save his animals, his tools, his entire livelihood, he lurched toward the fire. "Pa, stop!" Eliza cried, but it was too late. A massive burning beam crashed down from the barn's roof. It struck Thomas, sending him sprawling to the ground. Cal reacted instantly, rushing into the heat and smoke to drag the old man to safety. But the damage was done. The barn, what with everything in it, was a total loss. Thomas was unconscious, his body battered and his leg rebroken. They had been pushed back beyond ruin into the depths of utter despair. As Eliza knelt beside her father, The smoke stinging her eyes, she was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt, so profound it threatened to drown her. This was her fault. The stolen bread, the defiance, her stubborn pride, it had all led to this. Cal stood beside her, his face a mask of grim failure. He had promised to protect them. He had failed. The next morning rose on a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The barn was a heap of smoking, blackened timbers. The doctor had come and gone, his prognosis grim. Thomas had internal injuries. His life was hanging by a thread. The family was shattered, adrift in a sea of grief and loss. Into this tableau of despair rode Jedediah Thorne. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the scorched earth, a look of practiced sympathy on his face. He shook his head sadly as he surveyed the wreckage. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "My deepest condolences." He let his gaze drift from the ruined barn to Eliza's grief-stricken face. "I feel responsible in a way. This is a dangerous land. A family needs a strong protector." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want to help. It's an act of charity, of course, but I'll buy this land from you, pay you a fair price, relieve you of this burden." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, slimy whisper meant only for her. "And my other offer still stands. The one for employment. At the saloon. A pretty girl like you could make a very comfortable living. You wouldn't have to worry about fires or droughts or sick old men ever again." It was the final, twisting turn of the knife. He was standing on the ashes of her family's dream, offering to buy their legacy for pennies and install her as a prostitute. It was the ultimate humiliation, the absolute nodder of her life. And in that moment of absolute despair, something inside Eliza Abernathy snapped. The guilt, the fear, the grief, they were all burned away in a sudden, clarifying flash of pure, cold rage. She looked up from her father's still form, past Thorne's smug, triumphant face, and met Cal's eyes. He was watching Thorne with a look of murderous stillness. This wasn't the end. This was the breaking point. This was war. The silence in Cal's cabin that night was different. It was not the silence of awkwardness or grief, but the heavy, charged silence of a gathering storm. Eliza sat at the table, her hands folded, her posture rigid. The tears were gone. Her eyes, which had been filled with despair only hours before, were now as hard and cold as river stones. "He won't stop," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He thinks he's broken us. He'll keep pushing until we are dead or gone." "I know." Cal was at the hearth, but he wasn't staring into the flames. He was methodically, meticulously cleaning his Colt peacemaker. He moved with a focused economy of motion that Eliza had never seen before. The quiet, stoic rancher she had come to know was gone. In his place was the Texas Ranger he had tried to leave behind. "I made a mistake," Cal said, his voice low and tight. He worked a clean cloth through the revolver's barrel without looking at her. "I thought I could protect you by building walls, by hiding you away, but you can't build a wall high enough to keep out a snake. You have to go into its nest. You have to cut off its head." He finally stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes clear and hard. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal purpose. "This was never about a loaf of bread. And it isn't just about your family's farm anymore. It's about Redemption Gulch. He's bleeding the whole valley dry, but people are too scared, too broken to fight back. We have to make them see him for what he is. We have to give them a reason to stand up." A grim sense of resolve settled over Eliza. The righteous anger burning in her chest was a powerful fuel. It had burned away her fear, leaving only a steely determination. The question was no longer if they would survive, but how they would fight. "What do we do?" she asked. The I had become a we. Their contract, born of desperation, had been forged in shared adversity and was now tempered into a true weapon. They were no longer victims. They were partners. Their plan was a desperate gambit, a two-pronged assault on Thorne's empire of fear. Cal, with his ranger skills, would tackle the physical threat. Eliza, with her intimate knowledge of the town and its people, would fight for its soul. Cal rode out the next morning, not toward the Abernathy farm, but into the desolate Badlands where the bandit raids had been taking place. He was a ghost in the landscape, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the story left in the dust. He found what he was looking for in a hidden arroyo. The tracks of shod horses, a hastily abandoned campfire, a discarded cheroot of a brand only sold at Thorne's saloon. He followed the trail, confirming his suspicions. Thorne wasn't just profiting from the raids, he was orchestrating them. The Gallo brothers weren't just his thugs, they were his private army. While Cal hunted for proof, Eliza went to war. She rode into Redemption Gulch, but this time she did not bow her head. She moved with a quiet purpose that made people look twice. She went first to the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, whose prize anvil had been repossessed by Sheriff Brody over a disputed debt. She didn't ask for his help, she just listened as he spoke of his grievance, his voice a low rumble of impotent rage. She went to the doctor, who quietly told her how Thorne would hold back shipments of medicine, claiming they were lost to bandits, only to sell them a week later at triple the price. She visited Anna, a girl she had grown up with who now worked in the saloon, her eyes old before their time. Anna had seen it all. The backroom deals, the threats, the secret ledger where Thorne documented his true business, a meticulous record of his corruption. To each of them, Eliza offered not a plan, but a shared truth. She was a mirror, reflecting their own suffering back at them, reminding them that their individual pains were all symptoms of the same disease. She planted the seeds of rebellion, not with fire and brimstone, but with quiet empathy and a shared list of grievances. Anna was the key. "He's a vain man," she told Eliza in a hushed whisper, in the alley behind the saloon. "He loves to look at his money, even the dirty kind. He keeps a second ledger, a private one, hidden in his office. It has everything in it, the real loan amounts, the land grabs, who he's paid off. It's his Bible." The risk was enormous, but the prize was everything. They needed that ledger. The plan was set for Saturday night, the busiest night at the saloon. Cal would provide the distraction, Eliza would commit the theft. Cal entered the saloon looking like a man who had lost everything, his face a mask of grief and fury. He ordered a whiskey, then another. He stumbled into a table of Thorne's cronies, accusations flying. It escalated quickly into a massive, chaotic brawl. It was a masterful performance. Men were shouting, chairs were splintering, and Sheriff Brody and the Gallo brothers waded into the fray, their attention completely consumed by the need to subdue the wild man who had started it all. Amidst the chaos, Eliza, guided by a nod from Anna, slipped up the back stairs, her heart hammered against her ribs. The air in the upstairs hallway was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and cheap perfume. Thorne's office door was unlocked. She crept inside. The room was a monument to his ego, with plush leather chairs and a massive mahogany desk. Following Anna's instructions, she knelt and worked her fingers under the edge of a loose floorboard beneath the desk. It came up with a soft groan. And there it was, a slim, leather-bound book. The ledger. She clutched it to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she turned to leave, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Thorne. He had grown suspicious. Panic seized her. She dove into a narrow closet filled with dusty coats just as the office door swung open. She held her breath, convinced her pounding heart would give her away. Thorne entered the room, surveyed the scene, and then grunted in annoyance as the sounds of the brawl below grew louder, demanding his attention. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Eliza waited a full minute, her body trembling, before slipping out of the closet and escaping back into the night. Thorne's entire corrupt world held tightly in her hands. The next day, the sun beat down on the main street of Redemption Gulch. It was quiet, the town nursing a collective hangover from the previous night's brawl. The quiet was shattered by a single gunshot. Cal stood in the middle of the street, his revolver smoking in his hand. People emerged cautiously from their homes and businesses, drawn by the sound. Thorne and a bruised-looking Sheriff Brody stormed out of the mercantile, their faces livid. "What is the meaning of this, Rivers?" Thorne bellowed. "An announcement," Cal called back, his voice ringing with authority. "You've all been living in fear of bandits. You're right to be afraid, because the biggest bandit in this valley is standing right there." He pointed directly at Thorn. He kicked a dusty saddlebag into the center of the street, a bag he'd recovered from the gallows camp. It was clearly branded with the emblem of Thorn's own supply company. A murmur went through the growing crowd. Then, Eliza stepped forward, her fear gone, her voice clear and strong. She held up the ledger. "And this is his weapon," she declared. "This book is his confession. It's a record of every dollar he's stolen from you, every acre of land he's cheated you out of. Gus," she called out, her eyes finding the blacksmith in the crowd. "It says here you paid your debt in full 6 months ago. Dr. Miller, it lists the medical shipments he hid and then sold back to you. It's all here." She began to read, her voice ringing with the conviction of truth. She named names, listed dates, exposed crime after crime. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder, the fear on their faces slowly being burned away by the hot flame of anger. The truth was a spark, and their collective suffering was the kindling. Thorn, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic, saw his empire of lies crumbling around him. "Lies! They're all lies!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Brody, arrest them! Arrest them now!" Sheriff Brody drew his revolver, but he hesitated. He was no longer facing two desperate people. He was facing his neighbors, and their expressions were no longer fearful. They were furious. The blacksmith, Gus, stepped forward, a heavy wrench in his hand. Dr. Miller stood beside him. Others joined them, forming a human wall between the law and the truth. The line had been drawn in the dust. "That's an order, Sheriff. Shoot them!" Thorne screamed, his composure completely gone. The first shot, fired by a panicked Pablo Brody, broke the spell. The street erupted. It wasn't a clean, noble gunfight. It was a messy, desperate town reclamation. The townsfolk, armed with righteous fury, surged forward. Gus and his fellow citizens swarmed the terrified sheriff, disarming him and wrestling him to the ground. Cal moved with the lethal grace of a predator. His focus was on the true threats. The Gallo brothers, realizing their reign was over, tried to fight their way out. Cal's peacemaker spoke twice, the sounds sharp and final. The two thugs fell to the dust, their terror silenced forever. Thorn, his protectors gone, turned to flee. But his path was blocked by Eliza. She stood her ground, the ledger held like a shield. He made a desperate lunge for her, his face a mask of snarling hatred. He drew a tiny derringer from his vest pocket, his last resort. But before he could aim, Cal's final shot rang out, not to kill, but to disarm. The derringer flew from Thorn's hand, skittering across the dirt. He collapsed to his knees, a defeated, pathetic man surrounded by the ghosts of his greed and the faces of the people he had wronged. His power was broken. His town was his no more. A week later, Redemption Gulch felt like a different world. The air itself seemed lighter, cleaner. Thorn and Brody were locked in the town jail, their faces pressed against the bars, awaiting the arrival of a federal marshal. The town was buzzing with a newfound sense of purpose. A council, led by Gus the blacksmith and Dr. Miller, had been formed. They spent their days in the mercantile, poring over Thorn's ledger, the instrument of their oppression now the tool of their liberation. Land was being rightfully returned, fraudulent debts were being erased, and for the first time in years, the people were in charge of their own futures. The spirit of cooperation was infectious. Neighbors were helping neighbors. A crew of men was at the Abernathy farm, and the sounds of hammers and saws filled the air as a new barn began to rise from the ashes of the old one. The town was healing itself. As Cal and Eliza walked down the main street, people didn't avert their gazes. They smiled. They nodded. They were greeted with words of thanks and genuine respect. They were no longer the outcasts, the troublemakers. They were the catalysts, the heroes who had given the town back its soul. Samuel came running up to them, his sickness long gone, his face bright with the unblemished hope of youth. He took both their hands, and the three of them walked together through the heart of their reborn town. The final scene of their strange, violent story took place on the porch of the small cabin in the canyon. The sun was setting, painting the red rocks in hues of gold and rose. It was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of isolation, but the deep, comfortable peace of home. Eliza leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the vast, beautiful country that had almost destroyed her. Her father was resting comfortably on his way to a full recovery. The farm was secure, the war was over. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said softly. No, Cal agreed. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was open, vulnerable, full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. The contract is fulfilled, Eliza. You and your family are safe now. Thorn is gone. You're free to go if you wish. The marriage, it can be annulled. No one would think twice. He was offering her an escape, an end to the bargain. He was giving her back her life to do with as she pleased. She looked at him, at this quiet man who had ridden into her life and upended it completely. The stranger who paid for her bread, who respected her in silence, who tore down a dam in the dead of night, who confessed his own ghost to her, who walked into the fire for her and her family. She looked at the cabin, their Spartan, unlikely home. She thought of the journey, the fear, the fight, and the surprising, unlooked-for tenderness that had grown between them. A slow smile spread across her face, a real smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. The farmer's daughter was caught stealing bread, she said, reciting the first line of their history. A cowboy paid her debt. She closed the small distance between them and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. And he made her his wife. She looked up at him, her heart full. I think I'd like to stay his wife. Cal's hand tightened around hers. A slow, gentle smile touched his own lips, erasing the last of the shadows from his face. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace sure and strong. And there, on the porch of their maman, as the last rays of sun blessed the canyon, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of convenience or desperation. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss of love found in the ashes. A kiss that was the beginning of a new story. Their story, a future that was finally, truly their own.